Already it was getting dark. No daylight savings here. I went back to my bush bed and sat on a pile of creeper, thinking deep thoughts about life and trying not to get depressed. You have so much to be proud of, I lectured myself. You destroyed a huge container ship, and probably the jetty as well, judging by the size of the explosion. You wiped out one helicopter and indirectly accounted for another. I'll bet the plane was sent to check out the blast at Cobbler's, and it was because of you the chopper was sitting on the ground, so that was a bonus. You've done more fighting than anyone could have thought or hoped or expected. You shouldn't feel so bad. But none of that stopped me sinking slowly but surely into depression. I missed everyone so much. Homer with his strength and leadership and planning, Fee with her courage and grace, Kevin with the new energy he'd brought to our little group, Robin with her wisdom and goodness, Lee with his sexy body. Whoops, where did that come from? I wondered. I thought I was off Lee for life. Still, he was a good-looking guy. Most of all, though, I missed my mum and dad. Deep down inside, Ellie, the tough jungle fighter, was a baby. A 5-year-old waiting to be tucked into bed, read a story, kissed goodnight. The nicest times I'd had with Dad when I was little was when he read me bedtime stories. He'd lie on the bed and start a book, then fall asleep beside me more often than not. Of course, we worked together on the farm a lot, but he always seemed stressed then. If a calf got out of the cattle yards, or a dog scattered a mob of sheep, or it rained during shearing, he'd get so mad. There'd be a flood of swear words. He'd be red in the face and cursing the stock and the dog and the government and the whole farming industry and the heavens above, and me too if I was stupid enough to get in the way. Then Mum would upset me sometimes by telling me how worried she was about his blood pressure, and how his father had dropped dead in the middle of changing a tire on a tractor at the age of 45, and she was scared Dad would go the same way. I never really wanted her to talk to me about things like that, and yet I sort of liked it in a way. I felt like an adult, like we were talking on equal terms. It's one good thing about being an only child, I guess. Your parents do treat you like you're on the same level. Sometimes, anyway. Sometimes Dad treated me like I really was 5 years old. Once I left the gate on Cooper's, that's our biggest paddock, open, and the joined ewes that were in there wandered into one tree, another paddock, and got mixed up with the unjoined ewes. Dad went Burko that time. I thought he was going to hit me. Mum had to get between us to save me. I don't blame him. It was an extremely dumb thing to do. But he always acted like he'd never made a mistake in his life. After all, it wasn't me who sprayed Roundup on Mum's raspberries when she wanted to give them some fertilizer. Sometime in their marriage, Mum decided that she would stay sane by not getting caught up in Dad's moods. She did all the things that farmers' wives do in our part of the world. In fact, she did them better than most. But she didn't give the impression that there was nothing else in her life, the way Mrs. Mackenzie and Mrs. Brogan did. Mum seemed able to step away from it all. She often looked a bit amused by the things she found herself doing. When Mrs. Mackenzie won the jam section at the show, for instance, she'd get very excited and talk about it for weeks. When Mum won Best Sponge Cake, she just gave a sly smile and didn't say anything in public. But when we got home, she'd laugh and celebrate. One year, she even danced me around the kitchen. She had mixed feelings about it all. I guess that's what it boils down to. Maybe it was to do with her being a city girl originally. Her father was an accountant and she'd never been out of the city in her life, until a friend talked her into going to the Motoram B&S. The friend had a ute, and they took that because they thought it would look more rural. Sometime during the B&S, Dad, who must have been legless, staggered out of the hall looking for a place to sleep. Of course, he never admitted to being legless. He said he'd had a long, hard day marking lambs. Anyway, he curled up in the back of Mum's friend's ute, under the tarp, and had a good nap. When he woke, it was 10 o'clock in the morning and he was still in the ute, 300 k's from Motoram and doing 100 k's an hour. He had to bang on the back of the window to get the girls' attention. It was the first they knew they had a passenger. I can imagine the shock when they heard the banging and turned around to see a pair of bloodshot eyes staring at them through the glass. 4 months later, they were married. Dad was 23. Mum was 3 weeks away from her 19th birthday. I didn't arrive till 8 years later. I think they had a bit of trouble having me, but I never asked them about that. There are some things about your parents you really don't want to know. From the first, I loved the land. I don't know whether Dad wanted a son. Most places around Wirrawee are run by men and handed on from father to son. But he never gave me any sign of that. One time when a bloke at the Wirrawee sales yard was talking to us, He said to Dad, right in front of me, "If I had daughters, I wouldn't let 'em do stock work." Dad just looked at me for a minute while I waited to see what he would say. Finally he said, "Well, I don't know what I'd do without her." I went red with pleasure. It was the best compliment he ever paid me. I was 9 years old. I'm not saying I enjoyed everything about my life. When Dad was in one of his moods, it was no fun being at home. I didn't like some of the jobs, like mullising. Well, you'd have to be sick to like that. But I also didn't like feeding potties on cold mornings, chopping kindling and lighting the aga, putting the dogs back on their chains after they'd been for a run, finding mice in my bed during mouse plagues, and finding spiders in my gumboots a few minutes after I'd put them on. The best time of the year was definitely shearing. We only had a small shed, 2 stands, and as the economy got worse, Dad did a lot of the shearing himself. It was more fun when contractors came in, but I didn't mind either way. As soon as I was old enough, I became the rouseabout. That was a big moment in my life, being able to do that. Another big moment was being strong enough to throw a fleece onto the table for the classer. Again, Dad had been doing his own classing lately. It was something I wanted to learn. I'd been planning to do a course when I finished school. I loved the activity in the shearing shed. The sheep milling in their pens, the dogs lying in the shadows panting, their bright eyes watching the sheep, hoping they'd be called up again to run across their backs and shift them to the next yard or back to the paddock. I loved the oily feel of the classing table, the soft whiteness of the fleeces, the quiet bleating of the waiting sheep. I was proud to see our bales with our brands on them, on the back of a truck heading for the sales. I knew they were going halfway around the world to be made into wonderful warm clothes that would be worn by city people, people I'd never meet. Even the really hard-bitten farmers, the ones you'd think had as much poetry in them as a sedimentary rock, got a bit emotional about shearing. Dad used to look at photos of models wearing wool in Mum's fashion magazines with a kind of wonder in his face, like he could hardly believe that our great heavy fleeces could travel so far and be turned into things of such beauty. It was a long way from Wirrawee to Paris and Rome and Tokyo, but I don't want to give the impression that Dad was some rural redneck, like some of the men in our district. When Mum decided she wanted to do things that would extend her mind, he backed her all the way. She did a course in art appreciation, then one in medieval history, then one in Mandarin Chinese, and she joined a public speaking group in town. Dad was really proud of her and boasted to everyone about how smart she was. Some farmers didn't like their wives going to town more than once a week. When Mrs. Salter got offered a job as a part-time deck counsellor with the community services, her husband wouldn't let her take it. So it was pretty gutsy of my dad to stand up in front of his mates and take their jokes about his feminist wife. I have to admit, we are a few decades behind in Wirrawee sometimes. But despite all that, Mum was happiest in her kitchen. It was the warm heart of our house, and I think she felt comfortable in it. It was her territory and she was in control. She was a good cook, a creative one, who never followed a recipe exactly. She'd add a touch of basil here, a dash of Tabasco there, and a large swig of wine just about every time. Somehow it always seemed to work out. I can't remember any disasters, except when she sprinkled salt instead of caster sugar on my 12th birthday cake. She was so good in the kitchen that she intimidated me a bit. I kept to the simplest cooking: scrambled eggs, lamb chops, pasta, Anzac biscuits. There was never much doubt in my mind that I'd run the farm one day. We never talked about it, but I think we took it for granted. All I worried about was how I'd get Dad to give it up without him hanging around for 20 years afterwards telling me what to do. All of that seemed like a movie to me that night, though, lying under my mat of creepers, waiting for the long, lonely hours to tick away. I could call up these images of life as it used to be, but they seemed to be things that happened to other people, happy-looking people in an artificial world on a big screen. It seemed unreal. I cried myself to sleep, but it wasn't much of a sleep anyway. I was just lonely and scared and lost, and the morning seemed a long way away.